The Wager by David Grann. Read by Luke Treadaway. Episode 1. The only impartial witness was the sun. For days it watched as the strange object heaved up and down in the ocean, tossed by the wind and the waves. Yet somehow, whether through destiny, as some would later proclaim, or luck, it drifted into an inlet off the southeastern coast of Brazil, where several inhabitants laid eyes upon it. 50 feet long and 10 feet wide, it was a boat, though it looked as if it had been patched together from scraps of wood and cloth and then battered into oblivion. Its sails were shredded, its boom shattered. Seawater seeped through the hull, and a stench emanated from within. The bystanders, edging closer, heard unnerving sounds. 30 men were crammed on board, their bodies almost wasted to the bone. Some were so weak they could not even stand. But a figure who appeared to be in charge rose with an extraordinary exertion of will and announced that they were castaways from His Majesty's ship, the Wager, a British man of war. When the news reached England, it was greeted with disbelief. In September 1740, during an imperial conflict with Spain, the Wager, carrying some 250 officers and crew, had embarked from Portsmouth in a squadron on a secret mission to capture a treasure-filled Spanish galleon known as the Prize of All the Oceans. Near Cape Horn, at the tip of South America, the squadron had been engulfed by a hurricane, and the Wager was believed to have sunk with all its souls. But 283 days after the ship had last been reported seen, these men miraculously emerged in Brazil. They had been shipwrecked on a desolate island off the coast of Patagonia. Most of the officers and crew had perished, but 81 survivors had set out in a makeshift boat lashed together partly from the wreckage of the Wager. More than 50 men died during the arduous journey, and by the time the few remnants reached Brazil 3.5 months later, they had traversed nearly 3,000 miles. They were hailed for their ingenuity and bravery. As the leader of the party noted, it was hard to believe that human nature could possibly support the miseries that we have endured. 6 months later, another boat washed ashore, this one landing in a blizzard off the southwestern coast of Chile. It was even smaller, a wooden dugout propelled by a sail stitched from the rags of blankets. On board were 3 additional survivors, and their condition was even more frightful. After these men recovered and returned to England, they levelled a shocking allegation against their companions who had surfaced in Brazil. They were not heroes. They were mutineers. In the controversy that followed, with charges and countercharges from both sides, it became clear that while stranded on the island, the Wager's officers and crew had struggled to persevere in the most extreme circumstances. Faced with starvation and freezing temperatures, they built an outpost and tried to recreate naval order. But, as their situation deteriorated, the Wager's officers and crew, those supposed apostles of the Enlightenment, descended into a Hobbesian state of depravity. There were warring factions and marauders, abandonments and murders. A few of the men succumbed to cannibalism. Back in England, the principal figures from each group, along with their allies, were now summoned by the Admiralty to face a court-martial. The trial threatened to expose the secret nature not only of those charged, but also of an empire whose self-professed mission was spreading civilization. Each side believed that their very lives depended on the stories they told at the trial. If they failed to provide a convincing tale, they could be secured to a ship's yardarm and hanged. This is their story. Each man in the squadron carried, along with a sea chest, his own burdensome story. David Cheap, the first lieutenant of the Centurion, the squadron's flagship, a burly Scotsman in his early 40s with intense eyes, was in flight, from squabbles with his brother over their inheritance, from creditors, from debts. On shore, Cheap seemed doomed. Yet as he perched on the quarterdeck of a British man-of-war, cruising the oceans with a cocked hat and spyglass, he brimmed with confidence. The wooden world of a ship, a world bound by the Navy's rigid regulations and laws of the sea, had provided him a refuge. He felt a crystalline order, a clarity of purpose. The problem was that he was trapped at the dockyard in Portsmouth, struggling with feverish futility to get the Centurion fitted out and ready to sail. Its massive wooden hull, 144 feet long and 40 feet wide, was moored at a slip. Carpenters, caulkers, riggers and joiners combed over its decks like rats, which were also plentiful. A cacophony of hammers and saws. The cobblestone streets past the shipyard were congested with rattling wheelbarrows and horse-drawn wagons, with porters, peddlers, pickpockets, sailors, and prostitutes. It was January 1740, and the British Empire was racing to mobilize for war against its imperial rival Spain. George Anson had been plucked by the Admiralty to be a commodore and lead the squadron of 5 warships against the Spanish. David Cheap was to be his first lieutenant. The conflict with Spain was the result of the endless jockeying among the European powers to expand their empires. In the process, they subjugated and destroyed innumerable indigenous peoples, justifying their ruthless self-interest, including the reliance on the ever-expanding Atlantic slave trade, by claiming that they were somehow spreading civilization. Spain had long been the dominant empire in Latin America, but Great Britain was now on the ascendance and determined to break its rival's hold. Then, in 1738, Robert Jenkins, a British merchant captain, was summoned to appear in Parliament, where he reportedly claimed that a Spanish officer had stormed his brig in the Caribbean and accused him of smuggling sugar from Spain's colonies and cut off his left ear. Jenkins reputedly displayed his severed appendage, pickled in a jar, and pledged, "My cause to my country." The incident ignited the passions of Parliament and pamphleteers, leading people to cry for blood, an ear for an ear. The conflict became known as the War of Jenkins' Ear. British authorities soon devised a plan to launch an attack on a hub of Spain's colonial wealth, Cartagena. The South American city was where much of the silver extracted from Peruvian mines was shipped in armed convoys to Spain. The British offensive involved a massive fleet of 186 ships. But there was also another, much smaller operation, the one assigned to Commodore Anson. With 5 warships and a scouting sloop, he and some 2,000 men would sail across the Atlantic and round Cape Horn, taking, sinking, burning or otherwise destroying enemy ships and weakening Spanish holdings. The heart of the plan called for an act of outright thievery, to snatch a Spanish galleon loaded with virgin silver. Cheap, and the others ordered to carry out the mission, were lured by a tantalizing prospect, a share of the treasure. The Admiralty warned that the mission must be carried out in the most secret and expeditious manner, otherwise the squadron might be intercepted and destroyed by a large Spanish armada currently being assembled. Cheap was facing his longest expedition, and his most perilous. Yet if the squadron didn't embark quickly, the entire party would be annihilated by a force even more dangerous than a Spanish armada, the violent seas around Cape Horn, where winds routinely blow at gale force, waves climb to nearly 100 feet, and icebergs lurk. Seamen thought that the best chance to survive was during the austral summer, between December and February, but by March 1740, nearly half a year since the war with Spain had been declared, still the squadron was not ready to sail. It should have been an imposing force. Men of war were among the most sophisticated machines yet conceived. Cheap knew what a cracking ship the Centurion was. Swift and stout and weighing about 1,000 tons, she had 3 towering masts with criss-crossing yards, wooden spars from which the sails unfurled. The Centurion could fly as many as 18 sails at a time. 2 of the ship's decks had rows of cannons on both sides, their menacing black muzzles pointing out of square gun ports. In contrast, the Wager was the bastard of the fleet. Unlike the other men of war, it was not born for battle, but had been a merchant vessel. Intended to carry heavy cargo, it was tubby and unwieldy, a 123-foot eyesore. By the middle of July, the men of war were still missing the most important element of all: men. After peaceful efforts to man the fleets failed, the Navy resorted to what the Admiralty called a more violent strategy. Armed gangs were dispatched to press seafaring men into service, in effect, kidnapping them. Anson's squadron received scores of press-ganged men. Cheap processed at least 65 for the Centurion. Often the unwilling recruits deserted at the first opportunity, as did volunteers who were having misgivings. On the 23rd of August, 1740, after nearly a year of delays, the ships were ready. Anson ordered Cheap to fire one of the guns. It was the signal for the squadron to unmoor, and at the sound of the blast the entire force, the 5 men of war and an 84-foot scouting sloop, as well as 2 small cargo ships, stirred to life. Officers emerged from quarters. Boatswains piped their whistles and cried, "All hands! All hands!" Crewmen raced about extinguishing candles, lashing hammocks and loosening sails. Everything around Cheap seemed to be in motion, and then the ships began to move too. And then the wind, as fickle as the gods, shifted. Anson's squadron was forced to return to its starting point. Twice more it embarked, only to retreat. Yet on the 18th of September, as the sun was going down, the seamen caught a propitious breeze. Cheap assumed his commanding perch on the quarterdeck. He inhaled the salted air and listened to the splendid symphony around him, the rocking of the hull, the splashing of waves against the prow. The other captains fired their guns 13 times each in salute, a thunderous clapping, a trail of smoke fading in the sky. The ships emerged from the channel, born into the world anew, and Cheap, ever vigilant, saw the shore receding until, at last, he was surrounded by the deep blue sea. The Wager, by David Grann. Read by Luke Treadaway. Episode 2. In September 1740, HMS Wager, one of a squadron of 5 warships, sailed south through the Atlantic on her way to the Pacific Ocean on a secret mission to seize a galleon of Spain's silver. John Byron was awakened by the maniacal cries of the Wager's boatswain summoning the morning watch. Rouse out, you sleepers!" It was not quite 4 a.m. and still dark out. As midshipman on the Wager, he was only 16, John Byron's spot was below the lower deck in the aft of the orlop deck, a damp, dark, airless hole. Beneath was the ship's hold, where dirty bilge water pooled, its foul scent harassing Byron, who slept just above. Where you lay your head marked your place in the pecking order. The boatswain and his mates continued bellowing as they moved through the decks of slumbering seamen. Byron knew to stay clear of the burly figure named John King. Boatswains, who were responsible for herding crews and administering punishments, were notorious bruisers. Byron needed to rise quickly. The young midshipman, destined to become the grandfather of the poet Lord Byron, had been born into nobility, but left with few means to earn a respectable living, and, enraptured by the sea, he had volunteered for the navy. Now he dressed and hurriedly climbed a series of ladders between decks, making sure not to get lost in the interior wilderness of the ship. In the darkness, Byron heard scampering footsteps and a babble of accents. There were men from all strata of society, from dandies to city paupers. On board, too, were also dozens of boys, some as young as 6, training to become ordinary seamen or officers. And then there were wizened old men. The cook, Thomas Maclean, was in his 80s. Byron assumed his position on the quarterdeck. Those on watch did more than keep lookout. As a midshipman, Byron was expected to help with everything from trimming the sails to carrying officers' messages. He quickly discovered that each person had his own distinct station, with the captain at the pinnacle of this structure. The lieutenant, Robert Baines, was second in command. About 40 years old, he'd served in the Navy for nearly a decade. The crew found him maddeningly indecisive. He and other officers on duty supervised the watch and made sure that the captain's orders were being followed. The navigators plotted the ship's course and instructed the quartermaster on the proper heading. The quartermaster, in turn, directed the helmsman, who gripped the double wheel and steered. The non-seamen formed their own social unit, the sailmaker mending the canvases, the armourer sharpening swords, the carpenter repairing masts and plugging dangerous leaks, the surgeon attending to the sick. The seamen, too, were separated into divisions. The topmen, who were young and agile and admired for their fearlessness, scurried up the masts to unfurl and roll up sails and to keep lookout. One sailor described a man of war as a set of human machinery in which every man is a wheel, a band, or a crank, all moving to the will of its machinist, the all-powerful captain. In the morning hours, Byron would observe these components at work. He was still learning the art of seamanship, how to steer and splice and brace and tack. He also had to decipher a new, mystifying language, or he would be ridiculed as a landlubber. When ordered to pull sheets, he'd better seize the ropes instead of bedding. And God forbid he should say he was on a ship rather than in one. During the age of sail, when wind-powered vessels were the only bridge across the oceans, some nautical language was so pervasive that it was adopted by those on terra firma. To pipe down was the boatswain's whistle for everyone to be quiet at night. A ship was 3 sheets to the wind when the lines to the sails broke and the vessel pitched drunkenly out of control. One day, Byron heard that petrifying order eventually given to every midshipman, "Aloft you go!" Having trained on the smaller mizzenmast, he now had to clamber up the mainmast, which rose some 100 feet into the sky. With each roll of the sea, the mast swayed terrifyingly back and forth. He kept ascending, and the higher he went, the more he felt his body lurching from side to side, as if he were clinging to the tip of a giant pendulum. At 5 in the morning, on the 25th of October, 1740, 37 days after the squadron's departure from England, a lookout spotted something in the emerging light. It was the island of Madeira, the last stop before the nearly 5,000-mile crossing of the Atlantic. Anson ordered the crews to quickly replenish water and wood and load up on copious amounts of wine. He was eager to move on. Before they weighed anchor, the governor of Madeira informed Anson that lurking off the western coast of the island was a Spanish armada of 5 massive warships. News of Anson's expedition had leaked out, and the enemy knew everything about it. The squadron waited until dark to slip away, and Byron and his companions were ordered to extinguish the lanterns on board to prevent detection. No longer were they prowling the sea in secret. They were themselves being hunted. Soon afterwards, a marine on the Wager pounded a drum, the ominous beating to quarters, and men and boys rushed through the darkness to their battle stations. They cleared the decks of anything that could splinter into lethal shards during an attack. The men readied the ship's great guns, those 2-ton iron beasts with snouts extending 8 feet or more. They worked in silence, so that they could hear the orders being barked out. "Prick the cartridge! Point the gun! Take your match! Fire!" Standing amid the heat and light was the Wager's gunner, John Bulkley. He was among the few in the ship's ragtag company who seemed ready for a potential attack. But the call to arms turned out to only be a drill. Commodore Anson, after the recent intelligence about the lurking Spanish Armada, had grown ever more fanatical about preparing everyone for battle. Bulkley was a true seaman, and performed his tasks with the ruthless efficiency of one of his cold black guns. He seemed, as a naval officer noted, an instinctive leader. Yet he was stuck in his station. Unlike his captain or the midshipman John Byron, he was no silk-stocking dandy. He didn't have a powerful patron greasing his path to the quarterdeck. He might outrank Byron, but he was still considered socially inferior to him. Though there were instances of gunners becoming lieutenants or captains, they were rare, and Bulkley was too blunt, too certain of himself to flatter his superiors. There is no record of what Bulkley looked like, whether he was tall or short, bald or thick-haired. He couldn't afford to have the celebrated artist Joshua Reynolds paint a portrait of him the way Anson and Byron did. He emerges in our story like one of those settlers who arrives on the American frontier with no discernible history, a man to be reckoned with by his present deeds alone. Yet we can glimpse some of his private thoughts, because Bulkley could write, and write well. He wasn't required, like more senior officers, to maintain a logbook, but he kept one for himself anyway. These volumes, written on thick sheets of paper with quills and ink that sometimes smudged as the ship rocked or was sprayed with seawater, were formatted in columns under which were noted each day the direction of the wind, the ship's location or bearing, and any remarkable observations and accidents. These logbooks of memory created a record of any controversial actions or mishaps that occurred during a voyage. If need be, they could be submitted as evidence at courts martial. Careers and lives might depend on them. Bulkley relished recording what he saw. It gave him a voice, even if no one but him would ever hear it. Not long after Bulkley and his companions left Madeira, there came an invisible siege. Though no guns were fired, many of Bulkley's companions began to collapse. Boys could no longer muster the energy to climb the masts. Sailors lay writhing in their hammocks, feverish and sweating. Some were delirious. Typhus was erupting throughout the fleet. The infected were trapped on the squadron's overcrowded ships, with their lice-speckled bodies pressed against unsuspecting new victims. The Wager's surgeon, Ettrick, set up a sick bay on the lower deck. Doctors of his era had little scientific understanding of the disease, and he had no idea how to stop a typhus outbreak. By December, more than 65 members of the squadron had succumbed to the disease and been buried at sea. The squadron sailed on, Bulkley scouring the horizon for South America, for terra firma. Yet there was nothing to behold but the sea. There were glassy waters, and ragged white-capped waters, and brackish waters, and sunlit waters glittering like stars. Each time the squadron crossed a swathe of the immense liquid expanse, another appeared before them, as if all of Earth had been submerged. On the 17th of December, 3 months since their departure from England, Bulkley glimpsed an unmistakable smudge on the horizon. "We saw the island of St. Catherine at noon," he wrote excitedly in his logbook. Situated just off the southern coast of Brazil, St. Catherine was under Portuguese control. Cape Horn was still 2,000 miles south, and Anson was keen to press on, yet he knew that his men needed to recuperate. The squadron anchored, and Anson immediately sent ashore the hundreds of sick. Those who were fit set up a camp in a clearing and constructed shelters from old sails. The sickness did not release its grip, and at least 80 men and boys died on the island, their bodies buried in shallow, sandy graves. The men pressed on with their tasks, replenishing supplies and repairing sails. Charcoal burned inside the hulls to smoke out the cockroaches and rats, a procedure described as absolutely necessary. A month later, on the 18th of January 1741, the squadron shoved off for Cape Horn. Before long, the men were engulfed in a blinding squall, the first hint of the ominous weather to come. On the sloop, 8 young topmen were aloft reefing a sail when the mast snapped in the wind, catapulting them into the sea. 7 were rescued. An 8th man had become entangled in the rope tentacles of the rigging and drowned. After the storm lifted, Anson was informed that the commander of HMS Pearl, Captain Kidd, had died of fever. The death provoked a round of changes to the captaincies of the squadron's warships. The Wager would be getting a new leader, someone who had never been in charge of a man-of-war, David Cheap. The men wondered whether their new captain understood that the secret to establishing command was not tyrannizing men but convincing, sympathizing, and inspiring them, or if he would be a despot who ruled by the lash. Bulkley rarely betrayed emotion, and in his journal he coolly noted this turn of events. He wrote that Captain Kidd, on his deathbed, had delivered a prophecy concerning the expedition. It would end in poverty, vermin, famine, death, and destruction. The Wager by David Grann. Read by Luke Treadaway. Episode 3. After crossing the Atlantic, Commodore Anson's squadron of warships spent Christmas of 1740 on St. Catherine's Island off Brazil, before heading south towards Cape Horn. Scores of men had died of typhus, and the deaths had provoked a round of changes to the captaincies. And so David Cheap, someone who had never been in charge of a man-of-war, became HMS Wager's captain. The Wager's officers and crew gathered on deck, greeting David Cheap with all the pomp accorded to a captain of a man-of-war. Whistles were blown, hats removed. Yet there was an uneasiness. Just as Cheap was scrutinizing his new men, including the gunner, Bulkley, and the midshipman, Byron, they were eyeing their new captain. No longer was he one of them. He was in charge of them, responsible for every soul on board. His position required, another officer wrote, command of temper, integrity of purpose, vigour of mind, and abnegation of self. He is expected to bring a set of unruly and discordant beings into a state of discipline and obedience so that the safety of the ship may be staked upon. The new captain stood before them on the quarterdeck. It was his duty to recite the Articles of War, 36 rules regulating the behaviour of every man and boy on board. He went through the usual litany: no cursing, no drunkenness, no scandalous action in derogation of God's honour, until he came to Article 19. Its words held new meaning for him, as he uttered them with finality. No person in or belonging to the fleet shall utter any words of sedition or mutiny, upon pain of death. Cheap began to prepare the Wager for the passage round Cape Horn, the rocky, barren island marking the southernmost tip of the Americas. Because the far southern seas are the only waters that flow uninterrupted around the globe, they gather enormous power, with waves building over as much as 13,000 miles, accumulating strength as they roll through one ocean after another. When they arrive at Cape Horn, they are squeezed into a narrowing corridor known as the Drake Passage. The currents are not only the longest running on Earth, but also the strongest, transporting more than 4 billion cubic feet of water per second, more than 600 times the discharge of the Amazon River. And then there are the winds. Whipping eastward from the Pacific, where no lands obstruct them, they frequently accelerate to hurricane force and can reach 200 miles per hour. Seamen refer to the latitudes in which they blow with names that capture the increasing intensity: the roaring 40s, the furious 50s, the screaming 60s. Moreover, a sudden shallowing of the seabed in the region — it goes from 1,300 feet deep to barely 300 — combines with the other brute forces to generate waves of frightening magnitude. These Cape Horn rollers can dwarf a 90-foot mast. Floating on some of these waves are lethal bergs cleaved from pack ice. Cheap pored over his charts. Like the other captains in the squadron, Cheap was approaching this vortex partially blind. To determine his location, he needed to calculate his degrees of latitude and longitude. He could ascertain his latitude relatively easily by the stars, but calculating longitude was a conundrum. Cheap and his colleagues were forced to rely on dead reckoning, a process using a sand glass to estimate time and a knotted line dropped into the sea to approximate the ship's speed. The method amounted to informed guesswork and a leap of faith. Cheap guided the Wager southwards along the coast of what is now Argentina. He hugged the squadron's other ships and kept the decks cleared for battle in case the Spanish appeared, and he had the sails reefed and the hatches battened down. The currents pulled them on. The air became colder, rawer. Snow sometimes dusted the planks. Cheap stood exposed on the quarterdeck, bundled in his captain's uniform. He remained vigilant, peering at times through his spyglass. As the squadron traced the South American coastline, Cheap beheld the Andes mountain range, the snow-blown peaks rising in places more than 20,000 feet. By the night of the 6th of March, the squadron was off Tierra del Fuego's eastern extremity. For Cheap and the men, the supreme test of seamanship had arrived. Commodore Anson ordered the crews to wait till the morning light. The Wager drifted alongside the other ships, bow toward the wind, rocking back and forth as if keeping beat to some metronome. The sky above them seemed as vast and black as the sea. Cheap ordered his men to make final preparations. They replaced the worn sails with fresh ones and secured the guns. The bells counted down each half hour. Few men slept. Anson had carefully written out instructions for Cheap and the other captains, who were told to destroy these plans if their ships were about to fall into enemy hands. During the passage, Anson stressed, the captains needed to do everything possible to avoid being separated from the squadron. If they were forced apart, they were to proceed around the Horn and rendezvous on the Chilean side of Patagonia, where they were to wait for him for 56 days. One point he made especially clear. Should he perish, they must continue their mission and adhere to the chain of command. At the first crack of light, the squadron set off. The Trial and the Pearl led the way. The Anna and the Wager, the slowest and least sturdy ships, drew up the rear. As the ships entered the Strait of Le Maire, they bore close to the Isla de los Estados. The sight of this island unnerved the men. It consisted of nothing but rocks cloven by lightning and earthquakes, and rising 3,000 feet in pinnacles of icy solitude. Yet their passage appeared calm. The sky was bright blue and the seas serene. The ships were being swept easily, peacefully toward the Pacific. It was a prodigious fine passage, one thrilled captain wrote in his logbook. And then the clouds blackened, blotting out the sun. The winds began to wail, and angry waves emerged from nowhere, exploding against the hulls. The ship's prows plunged into the deep hollows before rearing upward pleadingly towards the heavens. The sails convulsed and the ropes whipped, and the hulls creaked as if they might splinter. Although the other ships gradually made headway, the Wager, loaded down with cargo, was caught in the currents and was being driven eastward, as if by some magnetic force toward the island. She was on the verge of being dashed to pieces. As the rest of the squadron looked on helplessly, Cheap summoned every able man on the Wager to his station, shouting commands. The topmen laboured up the teetering masts to furl the uppermost sails and reef the main. As Cheap braced himself on the quarterdeck, his face doused by the freezing spray, he marshalled every force, struggling to save the ship. His ship. Each time the Wager began to edge away from the island, the currents heaved her back toward it. But Cheap remained composed, until gradually, remarkably, he coaxed the Wager to safety. Unlike victories in battle, such feats against the natural elements, which were often more dangerous, garnered no laurels. Byron marvelled that they were very near being wrecked upon the rocks. The hard-bitten Bulkley appraised Cheap an excellent seaman. In that moment, Cheap had become the man he always pictured himself, a lord of the sea. Storms continued to batter the ships day and night. Water seeped through virtually every seam of the hull, flooding the lower decks. The temperature dropped further. Rains hardened into sleet and snow. Cables became encrusted with ice. Byron wrote that the winds blow with such violence that nothing can withstand it, and the sea runs so high that it works and tears a ship to pieces. Byron knew that the squadron needed every man and boy to persevere. But almost immediately after the Wager passed through the Strait of Le Maire on the 7th of March, 1741, he noticed that many of his companions could no longer rise from their hammocks. Their skin began to turn blue, and then as black as charcoal. Their ankles swelled hideously, and whatever was consuming them progressed up their bodies, into their thighs, and their hips, and their shoulders like some corrosive poison. Byron caught the disorder, and found that it engendered the most violent pain imaginable. As the scourge invaded the sailors' faces, some of them began to resemble the monsters of their imaginations. Their bloodshot eyes bulged, their teeth fell out, as did their hair, their breath reeked. The cartilage that glued together their bodies seemed to be loosening. They were suffering from scurvy. Like everyone else, Byron didn't know what caused it. Striking a company after at least a month at sea, it was the great enigma of the age of sail, killing more mariners than all other threats, including gun battles, tempests, wrecks, and other diseases combined. The outbreak raged on, a storm within the storm. Soon Captain Cheap was battling scurvy himself. What remedies existed were as worthless as the theories behind them, yet the solution was simple. Scurvy is brought on by a deficiency of vitamin C, owing to a lack of raw vegetables and fruits in one's diet. All Byron and his companions needed to combat scurvy was some citrus, and when they had stopped at St. Catherine to gather supplies, there had been an abundance of limes. The cure, if only they'd known, had been right within their grasp. As the squadron sailed on, Byron watched in anguish as many of the sick gasped for air. They appeared to be dry drowning, and one after the other they died. Nothing was more frequent than to bury 8 or 10 men from each ship every morning, an officer wrote in his journal. Altogether, on the Centurion, the warship under the command of Anson, nearly 300 of its 500 men were eventually listed as discharged dead. On the Wager, Byron saw the original company of some 250 officers and crew dwindle to below 200, and those who were alive were nearly indistinguishable from the dead, so weak and so much reduced, as one officer put it, that we could barely walk along the deck. One night in April, Byron and others in the squadron determined they'd made it far enough through the Drake Passage that they could finally turn north. But not long after the ships tacked north, the lookout on the Anna noticed, through the glancing moonlight, strange formations, rocks. The navigator's dead reckoning had been wrong, and by hundreds of miles. The ships were not west of the tip of the continent. Rather, they were, having been driven eastward by the winds and the currents, pinned against it. The squadron managed to turn just in time and avoid being wrecked, but more than a month after entering the Drake Passage, they had still not escaped the Blind Horn's hate. Byron's spirits were crushed. To get clear of the land, they were heading back south, back into the vortex of the storms. The Wager by David Grann. Read by Luke Treadaway. Episode 4. April 1741. Sent to destroy Spanish ships and capture a galleon packed with silver, Commodore Anson's squadron of ships was struggling around Cape Horn and the most perilous seas on earth. On board HMS Wager were David Cheap, the ambitious but inexperienced captain, the 16-year-old midshipman John Byron, and the seasoned gunner John Bulkley. Scurvy ravaged the ship's crew as one tempest succeeded another, with an escalating force that seemed destined to destroy the entire expedition. Each time the Wager went over a wave, Bulkley felt the ship hurtling on an avalanche of water, cascading into a chasm devoid of light. If Bulkley didn't keep himself fastened at all times, he would be catapulted through the air. One seaman, thrown into the hold, snapped his femur. Bulkley, in his journal, often carped about the Wager's officers. The boatswain was wicked, the master useless, the lieutenant more useless, and he had begun to harbour certain reservations about his new captain. Pacing with a silver-headed cane which clacked like a pirate's wooden leg, Cheap seemed hell-bent on conquering the elements and fulfilling his glorious mission. Every day the Wager was pelted and gouged. She pitched, she heaved, she groaned, she splintered. Then one day, after colliding with a wave, the mizzen, a vital mast, toppled over like an axed tree, crashing down with its rigging and sails into the sea. All that was left was a stump. Cummins, the ship's carpenter, immediately went to work with his mates, attaching a 40-foot boom to the stump and jury-rigging a sail. This steadied the ship some, and the Wager sailed on. On the 10th of April, 1741, 7 months after the squadron had departed England, and more than 4 weeks since it had entered the Drake Passage, 2 of its warships, the Severn and the Pearl, began to trail behind the others. Then they disappeared. "Lost sight of the Severn and the Pearl," Bulkley wrote in his journal. Some suspected that these ships' officers had given up and turned back around Cape Horn, retreating to safety. The squadron's remaining ships strove to stay together. To signal their location, they hung lantern lights and fired their guns every half hour. Bulkley knew that if the Wager became separated from the fleet, there would be nobody to rescue them from sinking or from a shipwreck. The Centurion, which carried Commodore Anson, was the first to disappear in the murk. After Bulkley spotted its flickering lights on the night of the 19th of April, he wrote, "This was the last time I ever saw the Commodore." He discerned the other ships in the distance, but they too were soon gone, the sound of their booming guns smothered by the wind. The Wager was alone at sea, left to its own destiny. David Cheap, commander of His Majesty's ship, the Wager, would never turn back. His company continued to wither, and his own body was hollowed out by scurvy. His ship, The first man of war under his charge was not just deformed, with its missing mast, torn sails, and bad leaks. It was alone upon the quaking sea. Despite all this, he sailed on, determined to find Anson at the rendezvous on the Chilean side of Patagonia. If Cheap failed at this challenge, was he truly a captain after all? Because the Wager was carrying much of the squadron's armaments, the success of the strike against the Spanish depended on him miraculously making it to the rendezvous. If Cheap prevailed, he would become a hero, his feats celebrated in the yarns and ballads of seamen. Watch after watch, bell after bell, he continued sailing, scraping, battling, until 3 weeks had passed since his separation from the squadron. With skill and daring, and a touch of ruthlessness, he had navigated the Wager around Cape Horn, and he was now hastening along the Pacific, heading northeast off the Chilean coast of Patagonia. In several days he would arrive at the rendezvous. Imagine Anson's expression when he saw the lost Wager. Yet as the Wager headed north, all the previous storms seemed to have combined in one climatic fury. But Cheap, his eyes inflamed, his teeth loosening, remained unwavering. He demanded that his crew brace the sails, clamber up the masts amid vicious gusts of wind, and work the pump. He relentlessly drove the men onward, drove them even as they dumped overboard a growing number of corpses. "Let the fate of particular persons be what it will," Cheap proclaimed, "but let the honour of our country be immortal." As they forged on, John Byron peered over the edge of the quarterdeck. Ever alert to nature, he noticed, floating on the rushing water, little green strands. Seaweed. He anxiously told the gunner, Bulkley, "We can't be far off the land." John Bulkley thought that their course was madness. According to the navigator, they remained safely west of the Patagonia coast of Chile, but his dead reckoning had been wrong before. And if they kept on a northeast tack, they might become entangled with an unknown lee shore and not be able to avoid wrecking. Bulkley went and asked Lieutenant Baines, the second in command, why they did not alter their course and turn west back out to sea. The lieutenant seemed evasive. When Bulkley pressed him again, Baines replied that he had spoken to Cheap and that the captain was intent on making it to the rendezvous in time. On the 13th of May, at 8 in the morning, Byron was on watch when several of the pulleys for the foresails broke. As the carpenter, Cummins, hurried forward to inspect them, thunderclouds cloaking the horizon parted ever so slightly, and in the distance he could see something shadowy and misshapen. Was it land? He approached Lieutenant Baines, who squinted but didn't see anything. After all, Baines reckoned the ship was still more than 150 miles from shore. He told Cummins that it was impossible for him to have discerned land, and he made no report of the sighting to the captain. Later that day, at 2 in the afternoon, Bulkley had to go aloft. A gale whipped against his body and the rain pricked his eyes. Up he went, up, until he reached the yard, which rocked with the ship, nearly plunging him into the water before lifting him back up to the sky. And that's when, as he recalled it, I saw the land very plain. There were enormous craggy hills, and the Wager was barrelling toward them. Bulkley raced down the mast and across the slippery deck to warn the captain. Cheap moved immediately into action. "Sway the foreyard up and set the foresail," he cried. Then he ordered the men to execute a jibe, turning the ship around by swinging its bow away from the wind. The helmsman cranked the double wheel, the bow began arcing downwind, but then the gale caught the sails from behind and the hull surfed the enormous waves. Cheap looked on in alarm as the ship headed faster and faster toward the rocks, and just before a collision was inevitable, the bow swung further around and the sails flung violently to the opposite side of the ship, completing the jibe. The Wager was now running parallel to the coastline on a southward trajectory, yet still being dragged toward the shore by the waves and the currents. the landscape of Patagonia revealed itself. Jagged and jumbled, with rocky islets and gleaming glaciers, with wild forests creeping up mountainsides and cliffs plunging straight down into the ocean. Cheap and his men were trapped in a bay known as the Golfo de Penas, or, as some would prefer, the Gulf of Pain. He thought they could claw their way out, but suddenly the topsails blew right off the yards. Seeing his men struggling to fix the rigging in the forecastle, he decided to go and help. Rashly, bravely, he rushed toward the bow, then fell through an open hatchway, plummeting about 6 feet before smacking the oaken deck below. He hit so hard that the bone in his left shoulder snapped and protruded from his armpit. The men carried him into the surgeon's cabin. "I was taken up very much stunned and hurt with the violence of the fall," Cheap noted as the surgeon gave him opium, and for once Cheap was at peace, sailing into the ether of his dreams. At 4:30 a.m. on the 14th of May, Byron felt the Wager judder in the darkness. The blow had come from underneath the hull. It was, he realized, a sunken rock. As the waves thumped the ship, it lunged forward and struck more rocks. The rudder shattered, and an anchor weighing more than 2 tons crashed through the ship's hull, leaving a gaping hole in the Wager. The ship began to teeter, rolling further over, and a panic took hold. "In this dreadful situation," Byron observed, "the Wager lay for some little time, every soul on board looking upon the present minute as his last." Another mountainous wave swept the ship, and she lurched onward, stumbling through a minefield of rocks, with no rudder to steer her, and with the sea pouring through the hole. The carpenter's mate Mitchell cried, "6 foot of water in the hold!" An officer reported that the ship was now full of water up to the hatches. Byron glimpsed the thunderous waves crashing everything in their jaws. The men prepared to die. Some fell to their knees reciting prayers in the spray. Lieutenant Baines retreated with a bottle of liquor. One veteran sailor, John Jones, tried to galvanize the men. "My friends," he shouted, "let us not be discouraged. Did you never see a ship amongst breakers before? Let us try to push her through them." His courage inspired several officers and crewmen, including Byron. Some grabbed ropes to set the sails. Others frantically pumped and bailed the water. Bulkley attempted to maneuver the ship by manipulating the sails, pulling them one way and then the other, and, astonishingly, that much-maligned ship kept going. She sailed on through the Gulf of Pain, without a mast, without a rudder, without a captain on the quarterdeck. The men quietly cheered her on. Her fate was theirs, and she fought with all she was worth, proudly, defiantly, nobly. At last, she crashed into a cluster of rocks and began ripping apart. The 2 remaining masts started to fall and were cut down by the men before they could pull the ship entirely over. The bowsprit cleaved, planks shattered, cabins collapsed, decks caved in. Water flooded the lower portions of the ship, snaking from chamber to chamber, filling nooks and crannies. Rats scurried upward. The men who had been too sick to leave their hammocks drowned before anyone could rescue them. The Wager, having improbably survived this far, offered one final gift to its inhabitants. "Providentially, we stuck fast between 2 great rocks," John Byron noted. Sandwiched, the Wager did not sink completely, at least not yet. And as Byron climbed to a high point on the vessel's ruins, the sky cleared enough for him to see beyond the breakers. There, shrouded in mist, was an island. The Wager by David Grann. Read by Luke Treadaway. Episode 5. Separated from their squadron as they rounded Cape Horn in 1741, The sailors on the Wager, storm-battered and sick with scurvy, were shipwrecked off the coast of Patagonia. David Cheap, the captain, had broken a bone, and his much-reduced crew faced the crisis all sailors dread. The Wager was stuck on the rocks, with waves breaking around her. The seawater bubbled up towards the surgeon's cabin, where Captain David Cheap lay motionless. Confined there since his injury, he had not witnessed the collision, but he knew that the Wager was lost. If he survived, he would face a court-martial to determine whether he had run His Majesty's ship aground because of willfulness, negligence, or other defaults. Would he be found guilty for wrecking the first man of war under his command, thus ending his naval career? Why had Lieutenant Baines not alerted him to the danger? The bone in Cheap's shoulder had been reset during a 3-hour operation, and he was still in great pain. The midshipmen Byron and Campbell approached the surgeon's cabin doorway, dripping, ghostly figures, seemingly from another world. They apprised Cheap of what had happened and told him about the island Byron had seen from a high point on the ship's ruins. A musket shot away, it appeared swampy, barren, and storm-swept, but it offered an escape. Cheap instructed them to immediately deploy the 4 vessels that were strapped on the deck: the longboat, the cutter, the barge, and the yawl. He insisted that as captain he must be the last to leave. "Go save all the sick," he said. The gunner, John Bulkley, tried to lower the transport boats, but there were no longer any masts from which to hoist them. Most of the men couldn't swim and were engaged in a grim calculus: jump amid the breakers and attempt to make it ashore, or linger as the ship disintegrated. The heavy longboat was buried under debris, but the men realized that the lighter barge could be dragged across the deck. "Come on, grab hold and heave." It was now or never. Bulkley, along with several strong sailors, lifted the barge over the gunwale and, using ropes, lowered it into the sea. Men began clamouring to get on board, pushing and shoving, nearly capsizing it. Bulkley watched as they rowed across the perilous waves, through the mist, and around the rocks, until they reached a beach on a corner of the island. It was the first solid ground they'd touched in 2.5 months, and they collapsed. Back on the Wager, Bulkley waited for some of them to return with the barge. None did. It was raining hard, and the wind now hissed from the north, bringing forth a tumbling sea. The deck quaked, stirring Bulkley and the others as only the prospect of death can, and they eventually succeeded in heaving the yawl and the cutter into the water. The sickest were ferried first. They grabbed whatever supplies they could. These included a few pounds of flour, guns and ammunition, cooking and eating utensils, a compass, a medicine chest, and a Bible. After several hours, most of the company had been evacuated, but the carpenter's mate Mitchell, who'd always had a murderous glint about him, refused to depart, as did a dozen or so of his cohorts. They were joined by the boatswain, King, the very officer who was supposed to be enforcing discipline. This faction began to break open casks of liquor and indulge themselves, preferring, it seemed, to die in one last orgy of revelry. Before abandoning ship, Byron and a few officers pleaded with Captain Cheap to come with them. Finally and reluctantly, he rose from his bed and was carried ashore. The castaways huddled on the beach in the cold, slashing rain. Cheap calculated that of the Wager's original complement of 250 men and boys, 145 had survived. They were a haggard, sickly, and scantily clad bunch. Cheap didn't know exactly where he and his men were, or what lurked around them. They were cut off, lost. He believed that the only way they might see England again was by preserving the cohesion of the ship. Already he was dealing with the fact that a group of drunks remained on the wreck. And were the men on the beach looking at him differently? Did they blame him for being marooned? Night was quickly coming on, and the men exerted themselves to look for shelter. After trekking a short distance, Byron noticed, tucked amid the woodlands, a dome-shaped structure. About 10 feet across and 6 feet tall, it was covered with brush and had an opening in the front. It was some sort of dwelling. No sign of the inhabitants. Inside the shelter were some lances and other weaponry. Several men squeezed in seeking refuge from the storm, and they cleared a space for Captain Cheap, who had to be helped inside. There was no room for Byron, and along with most of the others, he lay down in the mud. It stormed all night. By morning, he and the rest of the castaways were drenched. Near the shore, Cheap leaned on his cane, concerned about the renegades who had refused to abandon the ship. Determined to rescue them, Cheap dispatched the young midshipman Campbell to fetch them in the yawl. Campbell set off, and upon boarding the Wager, he was stunned by the bedlam. Mitchell and his gang, abetted by the boatswain, had commandeered what remained of the ship, pirating the wreckage like the survivors of an apocalypse. Some were singing psalms, Campbell noted, others fighting, others swearing, and some lay drunk on the deck. A few of the inebriates had fallen into the pooling waters and drowned. Fearing that the wreck was about to fully sink, the stragglers were successfully retrieved. As they paraded onto the island, Cheap fixated on their appearance. Over their tarred trousers and checkered shirts, they were wearing clothes of the finest silk and lace, which they had pilfered from the abandoned sea chests of the officers. Because King was the boatswain, Cheap held him most responsible, and as the other castaways looked on, Cheap stepped toward him. His left arm dangled lamely, but with his right one he raised his cane and struck King with such fury that the burly boatswain crumpled to the ground. Cheap cursed him as a rogue. Then he forced them all to remove the officers' clothing until they looked, as Bulkley put it, like a parcel of transported felons. Cheap had made it clear. He was still their captain. For the first 48 hours they had not spotted a single animal to hunt. Not even a rat. More surprisingly, perhaps because of the tremendous breakers, the waters near the shore seemed empty of fish. Finally, somebody shot a seagull, and Captain Cheap ordered that it be divvied among the group. The old cook plucked the bird and boiled it in a large pot, sprinkling in some of their flour to make a thick soup. The steaming portions were doled out. Byron relished his share. Yet moments later, they were all, as Byron put it, seized with the most violent retchings. The flour had been contaminated. More depleted than before, the men scavenged the beach for mussels and snails until Byron discovered something infinitely more valuable. A wooden cask filled with salted beef. On the 17th of May, 3 days after the wreck, the gunner, John Bulkley, savoured a few scraps of meat. Like the majority of the castaways, Bulkley had no shelter. He was eating, sleeping, and squatting outside. The temperature hovered around freezing, and the blistering ocean winds made it the kind of cold that killed. The men pondered their situation. Though Cheap had punished the renegades, they remained a source of turbulence, and throughout the company Bulkley heard growing murmurings and discontent about the captain. Bulkley knew that none of them would survive much longer without additional sources of food. Loading his musket, he set out with a party to explore the island. The ground was boggy, and their feet sank as they slogged up the wooded hillsides. After a while, they gave up trying to cross the island. It was too impenetrable. The only nourishment they had gathered was a couple of woodcocks and some wild celery. Meanwhile, Byron and a few companions climbed the small mountain overlooking their encampment. When he reached the summit, in every direction Byron looked, the wilderness spanned into more wilderness, remote, impassable, and chillingly beautiful. He noticed that the island was battered on all sides by a wild, frothing sea. There seemed to be no escape. Captain David Cheap emerged from his dwelling carrying a pistol. The men continued to look at him doubtfully. After less than a week on the island, he was in danger of losing their trust as they realized the full extent of their predicament. Cheap knew that unity was paramount to their survival. Ill and hobbling, he had to cope with his own torments. Yet he domineered. Cheap believed the castaways needed rules and structures, and their commander. Summoning everyone, he reviewed the Articles of War, reminding them that the rules still applied on land, particularly those prohibiting any mutinous assemblies, practices, designs, on pain of death. The men all needed to pull together. Given the lack of food, he decided that his men must salvage the wreckage of the Wager, where a few segments of the quarterdeck and forecastle were still above water. For this hazardous mission he chose Bulkley and Byron and a small team of recruits, who set off in a small boat. Once their boat was fastened to the Wager, they slithered onto the wreckage. With considerable difficulty, they managed to extract 10 barrels of flour, a cask of peas, several casks of beef and pork, some oatmeal, and more brandy and wine. They also retrieved canvas, carpentry tools, and nails. On shore, Cheap erected a tent by his dwelling and stored all the provisions and munitions. No one was allowed access without his permission. At times, Bulkley bristled at all the rules and regulations, but after a week there was generally a new sense of purpose. Cheap seemed calmer, and he and his men soon received an inexplicable blessing. Their scurvy began to be cured, unbeknownst to them by the island's wild celery. And one day they discovered a new source of nourishment, a seaweed which, when boiled in water, made what Bulkley deemed a good and wholesome food. With the carpenter, Cummins, Bulkley began collecting branches, which the men hammered into a skeletal frame. Then they picked reeds from the forest and used them to cover the frame's exterior. Using strips of canvas sails, they divided the space into 14 quarters, or cabins, as Bulkley called them. They had built a dwelling, and other castaways soon followed suit, creating, Byron noted, a kind of village with no less than 18 houses in it. The castaways gave names to the places around them, making them their own: Cheap's Bay, Mount Misery, Wager Island. After only a few weeks, hunger began to gnaw at the men again. Byron realized that he now had to cope with the most unpredictable and volatile creatures in all of nature: desperate humans. Late one evening, someone sneaked into the supply tent and stole a great deal of flour. The burglary threatened the very survival of the group. On another day, while Mitchell and a fellow seaman were out searching the Wager, Byron and a party went out to join them. When they arrived, they noticed that the seaman who had been with Mitchell was lying on the half-submerged deck. He was dead, and there were strange marks around his neck. Though Byron couldn't prove it, he suspected that Mitchell had strangled him so that he could keep all the spoils that they had salvaged from the wreck. The Wager by David Grann. Read by Luke Treadaway. Episode 6. For HMS Wager, disaster struck on the 14th of May, 1741. 8 months earlier, a squadron of warships, including the Wager, had set out across the Atlantic on a mission to destroy Spanish ships and capture a galleon packed with the enemy's silver. After surviving treacherous seas and disease, the Wager had rounded Cape Horn, but had become separated from the rest of the squadron. Caught in a storm, she was shipwrecked on an island off Patagonia. Weeks have gone by, and the ship's captain, David Cheap, sick and injured, has struggled to command his men, as hunger gnaws at their bodies and their resolve. Snow began to fall, swirling with the winds and piling in great drifts. Everything seemed whited out, as if being erased. The gunner, John Bulkley, wrote in his journal, "It freezes very hard, and we find it extremely cold." Before the blizzard, while Bulkley was searching the wreck with the midshipmen Byron and Campbell, 3 slender canoes had appeared out of the mist. Unlike the castaways' rickety rafts, These were sturdy and strong, made from overlapping sheaths of bark meshed together with whale tendons and curved elegantly upward at the bow and the stern. A fire was somehow kept going inside each canoe, and the paddlers manoeuvred expertly through the breakers. Byron and his companions stared at the men they deemed savages. They were a party of Kaweska, which means people who wear skins. They had a population of a few thousand, and their territory spanned hundreds of miles along the coastline of southern Chile. Over the centuries they had adapted to the harsh environment. They knew every indentation of the coastline, every shelter, stream and reef, and the places to find food. Byron, Bulkley and Campbell waved their hats at the paddlers, beckoning them closer. The Kaweska were hesitant. They had heard tales about the murderousness of pale boat people. The three Englishmen held up bales of cloth that had been retrieved from the wreck and offered them as gifts. They took them and were persuaded to come ashore. They hauled their canoes up the beach and followed Byron and Campbell through the little village of bizarre shelters, watching and being watched. They were led to Captain Cheap, who was evidently living in their dwelling. Cheap greeted the strangers ceremoniously. They represented his best and perhaps only hope for finding food for his men. He presented each with a sailor's hat and a red soldier's coat and a mirror. They were strangely affected with the novelty, Byron wrote. After a while, the Kaweska departed in their canoes, but 2 days later they returned, this time carrying with them a surprising amount of food, including 3 sheep, and what Bulkley described as the largest and best mussels I ever saw or tasted. The famished Englishmen were extremely grateful. Aware of how helpless the Englishmen were, the Kaweska would regularly venture out to sea and then magically return with nourishment for them, mainly fish and sea urchins. The Kaweska had provided Cheap with a lifeline, but after only a few days, the carpenter's mate Mitchell and other sailors began to run amok again, stealing liquor and carousing. Word spread that Mitchell and his marauders were conspiring to steal the Kaweska's canoes and flee the island. The Kaweska witnessed the insidious tensions mounting among the castaways, and one morning when Cheap awoke, he discovered they had all gone. They had slipped away in their canoes, taking with them the secrets of their civilization. That June, with winter upon them, the temperature was consistently below freezing. The hail, Bulkley wrote, beat with such violence against a man's face that he can hardly withstand it. After less than a month on the island, John Bulkley was watching the company fracture into warring parties. First, Mitchell and his band of 9 outlaws deserted the main group and set up their own base a few miles away. They were known as the Seceders, and they were armed. Then one of the seamen at the encampment disappeared while foraging, and a search party discovered his body stuffed in the bushes. The victim, Byron wrote, had been stabbed in several places and shockingly mangled. Byron suspected that Mitchell had committed no less than 2 murders since the loss of our ship. The discovery of the body, and the discovery that some crewmen were willing to kill to survive, shook the search party. Rifts were also growing among the men at the settlement. Many of them, including the boatswain John King, had become brazenly vocal in their disdain for Captain Cheap. To them he was stubborn, he was vainglorious, and he had led them into this hellfire and was now incapable of getting them out. What gave him the right to rule with absolute power when there was no ship, no admiralty, no government at all? Midshipman Campbell, who remained loyal to Cheap, lamented that the Wages Company was sinking into a state of anarchy. The shipwreck had laid waste to the old hierarchies. Every man had now been dealt the same miserable hand. Bulkley observed that such conditions, cold, hunger, disarray, could really make a man weary of life. But amid this levelling and squalor, this democracy of suffering, Bulkley seemed to thrive. He maintained his fine shelter and thinned out the vegetation surrounding it, and whereas many of the company seemed merely to be waiting for death, he continued to forage fanatically, hunting birds, scraping seaweed off rocks, extracting what supplies he could from the wreckage. He noticed that more and more of the people, as he referred to the castaways, were flocking to his house, and in particular to him, John Bulkley, to figure out what the party should do next. Captain Cheap, meanwhile, was worried about thieves. Like insidious rats, they kept sneaking into the store tent at night and absconding with precious nuggets of food. He issued a proclamation. All his officers and the Marines must take turns guarding the store tent. Soon 3 men were caught pilfering food. Cheap decided that the accused men must be governed by the rules of the Navy, and he resolved that they would be hauled before a court-martial. All 3 were condemned to 600 lashes and banished to a rocky islet off the coast, and be left there until the company had means of returning to England. Surely after such a severe punishment no one else would dare defy his orders and put his own needs above those of the company. But before long, 4 bottles of brandy and 4 bags of flour disappeared from the store tent. Privation was a greater threat than any punishment Cheap could inflict. Cheap was no longer sure whom he could trust. Even among the officers he detected signs of disloyalty. Then there was John Bulkley. He assured the captain that never would he engage in any mutiny against him, but the gunner was constantly holding meetings, forming alliances, building his little empire as if he were the monarch of the island. On the 7th of June, nearly a month after the wager had run aground, he gave a simple order to Midshipman Henry Cousins to roll a cask of peas salvaged from the wreck into the store tent. Cousins, appearing unsteady from liquor, insisted that the cask was too heavy, and began to turn away. A midshipman refusing his captain. Cheap smacked him with his cane. Then he ordered Cousins seized and imprisoned. That evening, Cheap checked on his prisoner. Cousins hurled a torrent of curses at him, the insults ringing through the camp. In a fury, Cheap raised his cane to beat Cousins, but he was restrained. The captain quickly recovered himself, and, in a surprising act, he released Cousins from confinement. But some of the men gave the midshipman more liquor, and Cousins began to cause another ruckus, this time quarrelling with the purser, Thomas Harvey. A few days later, Cousins was in line, awaiting his share of the rations, which the purser was distributing, when he heard a rumour. Cheap had decided to cut his amount of wine. Cousins stampeded towards Harvey to demand his share. Still simmering from their earlier dispute, the purser drew his flintlock pistol and took aim, calling Cousins a dog and accusing him of intending to commit mutiny. A nearby seaman interceded and knocked the barrel upward just as Harvey pulled the trigger. The bullet soared past Cousins. Hearing the shot and the shouting about mutiny, Cheap burst out of his dwelling, his eyes ablaze, his pistol in hand. He looked around for Cousins. "Where's that villain?" he shouted. There was no reply, but he spied Cousins amid the growing crowd. Cheap walked over, and with neither questions nor ceremony, placed the cool tip of the barrel against Cousins' left cheek. Then, as he would later describe it, he proceeded to extremities. At the sound of the blast, John Byron ran from his hut and saw Cousins on the ground, weltering in his blood. Captain Cheap had shot him in the head. Many of the men stood back, afraid of Cheap's rage, but Byron went over and knelt by his messmate's side as the rain washed over him. Cousins was still breathing. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. The crowd was becoming uneasy. Cousins had no weapon. Cheap's response was inexcusable. Amid the rising clamour, Cheap ordered the men to stand in assembly. Cheap's once solid frame had been eaten away by hunger, yet as he faced the line of men he held his ground, gripping his pistol. "I am still your commander, so let every man go to his tent." There was a moment of uncertainty as the sea broke against the shore. Bulkley and his men knew that if they refused to comply, they would be taking the first step toward overthrowing their appointed captain. Cheap's rash shooting of Cousins, Byron noted, had nearly provoked open sedition and revolt. But eventually Bulkley retreated, and the rest of the castaways followed suit. Finally, Captain Cheap ordered that Cousins be taken to the sick tent. The surgeon used bandages to try to staunch the bleeding, and the next day they operated. The surgery, without anesthesia, was just as likely to kill Cousins as to save him. Somehow the midshipman survived, but he was still in danger of dying from loss of blood. "If he lives," Cheap said coldly, "I will carry him a prisoner to the Commodore and hang him." But Cousins was already fading. On the 24th of June, Bulkley wrote, "Departed this life Mr. Henry Cousins, midshipman, after languishing 14 days. The castaways were extremely affected at this catastrophe. Cold, filthy, ragged, they trudged outside and dug a hole in the mud. "We buried him in as decent a manner as time, place, and circumstances would allow," Bulkley recalled. They had been trapped on the island for 41 days. The Wager by David Grann, read by Luke Treadaway. Episode 7. The men of HMS Wager had been cast away on the island off Patagonia for 41 days. Dissatisfaction was rife. They were starving, and after Captain Cheap shot the unarmed midshipman Cousins, faith in his leadership was waning. The men saw a glimmer of salvation. The carpenter, Cummins, came up with a novel idea. If they could rescue the longboat that had been submerged with the wreck, they might be able to remake it into an ark, one that could carry them off the island. In the days immediately after Cousins' death, Cheap secluded himself in his hut, brooding, rationalizing, despairing. Would the Admiralty deem his shooting justifiable, or would he be hanged for murder? Cheap began to frenetically pursue Cummins's plan. First, they retrieved the damaged longboat and heaved it ashore. To fit more people in it, the 36-foot hull would have to be extended at least another 12 feet. Cummins sawed the boat in half. Then the real trick began. Somehow stitching these pieces not only back together again, but also in an entirely new form, one that was longer, wider, and stronger. They also made 2 masts for the vessel, so that it could power through the tremendous seas. Cheap's plan, meanwhile, was taking on new, hidden dimensions. Poring over charts, he began to believe that there was a way to not only preserve their lives, but also fulfill their original military mission. He calculated that the nearest Spanish settlement was on the island of Chiloé, some 350 miles north. They could sail there using the Ark. Once they arrived in Chiloé, and to him this was the most magnificent part, they could mount a daring attack on an unsuspecting Spanish trading ship and, having taken this vessel and its stores of food, sail to the rendezvous point and search for Commodore Anson and the rest of the squadron. Meanwhile, Bulkley too was seized by an idea. The Strait of Magellan, the 350-mile passageway between the end of the South American mainland and Tierra del Fuego was about 400 miles south of Wager Island. With their eventual new longboat, he thought, the castaways could cross through the strait and into the Atlantic, then head north to Brazil. Its government would surely provide a safe haven and facilitate their passage back to England. The total distance from Wager Island to Brazil would be nearly 3,000 miles. Bulkley conceded that many would deem it a mad undertaking, but the route had a deeper seduction. They would be charting their own destiny, emancipating themselves from a naval mission that had been bungled from the outset. Bulkley shared his vision with the other men, who were faced with a fundamental choice. They were tired of war, tired of death and destruction, and longed to go home, but to turn back meant they'd be abandoning their mission. And, to make things worse, Cheap had just announced that he expected them to do their patriotic duty and head in the opposite direction, to Chiloé. Byron watched as the outpost, briefly united over building the Ark, now split into two rival forces. On one side were Cheap and his small but loyal cadre, on the other were Bulkley and his legions of partisans. Byron was forced to choose between his commanding officer and the charismatic gunner. He felt duty-bound to Cheap, and he viewed Bulkley as someone who was undermining the captain and fueling his deep insecurities and paranoia. On the other hand, Bulkley seemed far more composed and suited to command the men in their nightmarish circumstances. Unrelenting, ingenious, and cunning, he had emerged as a leader on his own merits. By contrast, Cheap's expectation that the men would unwaveringly follow him was based solely on the chain of command. And in his desperation to maintain his authority, he had become even more fanatical. The following day, Cheap saw Bulkley approaching with an entourage. The gunner held up a piece of paper and began to read it aloud. "We, whose names are undermentioned, think it the best, surest, and most safe way for the preservation of the body of people to proceed through the Strait of Magellan for England." At a meeting the previous day, Bulkley had invited the men who wanted to sign the petition. One by one they'd done so, including Byron. Bulkley handed the smudged paper to Cheap, who saw the long list of squirrely signatures at the bottom. Cheap could count on one hand the number of his men who had not signed: the surgeon, Elliot, the Marine Lieutenant Hamilton, and, significantly, Baines, his second in command. Cheap had to think about his next move. Holding the document, he dismissed the gunner and his entourage, saying that he would respond after he had considered it. 2 days later, Bulkley and Cummins were summoned by Cheap. "Think on the distance to Brazil," he urged. "With the wind always against us and no water to be had." Bulkley and Cummins counted that they'd carry a month's worth of water in the longboat and could use the small transport crafts to row ashore and collect provisions. Cheap didn't budge. If they headed toward Chiloé, they could seize a trading vessel loaded with provisions. Cummins asked how they could capture a vessel without any cannons. "What are our muskets for?" Cheap replied, "but to board an enemy ship." As the acrimony grew, Cummins snapped, "Sir, 'tis all owing to you that we are here." And there it was, that long, festering accusation. Cummins did not let up, insisting that the captain had no business heading toward land with the Wager in its condition and all the men sick. "You do not know my orders," Cheap said. "I was obliged." Bulkley responded that a captain, no matter his orders, must always use his discretion. Surprisingly, Cheap let the comment go and signalled that the meeting was over, and asked Bulkley and Cummins, "Have you any more objections to make?" "Yes, sir, one more," Bulkley responded. He wanted the captain's assurance that if they did set off together in the longboat, he would not do anything, alter their course, launch an attack, without consulting his officers. Cheap could no longer contain himself. He cried out that he was still their commander. On the 27th of August, Bulkley met secretly with his most trusted men. Although 3 weeks had passed since Cheap had been given the petition, he still had not offered a final response. Bulkley concluded that the captain had no intention of ever agreeing the Brazil plan because he would never countermand his original orders. He broached that forbidden subject, mutiny. He argued that they would be justified in rising up. He believed that, as castaways, the rules of the Navy are not sufficient to direct us. To survive, they needed to establish their own rules. Yet Bulkley knew that if he and the others were caught plotting a rebellion against Cheap, they might be shot before ever leaving the island. Even if they succeeded and made it back to England, they could be court-martialed by a panel of Cheap's fellow officers and hanged. They had to tread carefully. The first step was to obtain the backing of Lieutenant Baines. It was imperative that Baines, at least nominally, assume the title of captain to help prove to the Admiralty that Bulkley was not out to destroy naval order and take power for himself. Baines thought heading through the Strait of Magellan was the wisest course, but seemed afraid of the repercussions of breaking with the captain. Baines finally agreed to oust Cheap under one condition. They would first draft a document expressing their reasons for sailing to Brazil and give Cheap an opportunity to sign it. If he agreed, he'd be allowed to remain captain, though with his powers severely curtailed. If Cheap balked at these terms, they would overthrow him. The shooting of Cousins, they believed, had provided a firm basis for arresting him. Bulkley drew up the document on a scrap of paper. The next day, Bulkley and Baines went with a party to confront Cheap. Bulkley read the document aloud. When he finished, he asked the captain to sign it. Cheap refused, and flew into a rage, telling them that they had insulted his honour. For days afterwards, David Cheap could hear his enemies regrouping. He was isolated, a captain without a company. He listened as the men, whom he dubbed "my mutineers," assembled in military formations and practiced firing their weapons. Starvation continued to ravage them. More than 50 castaways had perished on the island, and some of Byron's companions were so famished they had begun to contemplate a dire remedy: eating the dead. A delirious boy had cut off a piece of a cadaver before it was buried and had to be restrained from consuming it. And though the men knew not to even mention cannibalism in their written records, Byron acknowledged that some began to butcher and eat their dead companions, what Byron referred to as the last extremity. On the 5th of October, after 144 days on the island, Byron gazed upon what seemed like a hunger-induced mirage. There, on the blocks where the fragments of the longboat had once been, rested a glorious hull. 10 feet wide and more than 50 feet long, it had a deck, a hold, a tiller, and a bowsprit. The men christened her the Speedwell. Bulkley proclaimed that God had given them a vessel for their deliverance. On the 9th of October, Bulkley and his fellow conspirators began to quietly assemble a ragtag army of castaways, half-clothed, starved figures with muskets, bayonets, and pistols. In the creeping dawn, the party went to Cheap's dwelling and burst in. Before he could reach for his gun, they grabbed him and, as one officer put it, abused him, somewhat rudely. Bulkley explained that they were there to arrest him for the death of Cousins. The boatswain, King, sauntered over to Cheap, cocked his fist, and slugged him in the face. "It was your time, but now, goddamn you, it is mine," King said. "You are a scoundrel for using a gentleman ill when he is a prisoner," Cheap said, his face streaked with blood. As the de facto commander, Bulkley felt the burden of being fully in charge as he began to make final preparations for the voyage to Brazil. Out of the Wager's original complement of some 250 men and boys, 91 were still alive. The plan was to transport Cheap back home prisoner so that he could stand trial for murder. but Cheap told Bulkeley that he'd rather be shot than carried off a prisoner. He asked to be left on the island with anyone who wanted to stick with him. Bulkeley wrote that he conferred with the men, who said, "Let him stay and be damned." On the 14th of October, 1741, 5 months after being shipwrecked and more than a year since departing England, Bulkeley's party boarded the boats. They were eager to flee their imprisonment in the wild, yet they were also afraid to be embarking on another voyage into the unknown. At 11 in the morning, Bulkeley in the commander's perch on the Speedwell, they shoved off into Cheap's Bay and the crashing surf. The Wager by David Grann, read by Luke Treadaway, Episode 8. The mutineers led by Bulkeley have escaped the bleak island of Patagonia, where they had been shipwrecked for 5 months in 1741. After the refurbished longboat, the barge and the cutter shoved off for Brazil, the midshipmen Byron and Campbell began to have misgivings about leaving Captain Cheap behind on the island. So, together with 8 other castaways, they sneaked away in the barge, returning to their commander and escaping the stain of dishonour and cowardice that accompanied desertion and mutiny. Despite the defections, Bulkeley and his band of mutineers have continued on their perilous way. As the men forged onward, it became clear, even to old sea dogs like Bulkeley, that the journey in the castaway boats would be unlike anything they had ever experienced. The longboat, which the men had christened the Speedwell, was jammed with enough water to last them a month, and with enough guns and ammunition to ward off an attack. Most of all, it was crammed with men. With 59 people on board, there was no space to lie down, and it was nearly impossible for the crew to move about to raise a sail or pull a rope. The hold was as dank and dark as a coffin, but provided a measure of protection from the elements. Weighed down with human cargo and supplies, the hull rested so low in the sea that its stern was barely 4 inches above the waterline. Even small waves washed over the gunwales, soaking the men. The 12 people on the cutter had it worse. The boat was only 25 feet long, and it was even less stable in the waves. There was no area below where the crew members could find shelter, and at night they would sometimes clamber onto the Speedwell to sleep, while the cutter was towed behind. At such times, the longboat was stuffed with 71 men. Not only did these vessels have to traverse some of the roughest seas on earth, most of the men attempting to pull off this feat were already near death. The greatest part of the people on board was so regardless of life that they really appear quite indifferent whether they shall live or die, Bulkeley wrote. For him, leading the party under such circumstances was extraordinarily challenging. On the 6th of November, after heading into a cove and deploying the cutter to collect shellfish, they tried to get some rest. The cutter was roped to the stern of the Speedwell, and its crew, except for a seaman named James Stewart, crawled onto the Speedwell to sleep. At 2 in the morning, the rope snapped, sending the cutter careening across the sea. Bulkeley and several of the men looked out in the rain-swept darkness. There was Stewart, on the boat, barreling towards the reefs. The men called to him, but he was too far away to hear them, and before long, the cutter was gone. The men had lost not only another companion, but also their means of going ashore for sustenance. Moreover, 70 castaways would now have to be packed day and night into the Speedwell. Great uneasiness among the people, many of them despairing of a deliverance, Bulkeley wrote. Almost a month into the voyage, and after travelling some 400 miles, they reached the Strait of Magellan. Bulkeley tacked the Speedwell to the southeast, and felt a surge of absolute fear. "I never in my life have seen such a sea as runs here," he observed. The winds were of typhoon strength, and the waters seemed at war with themselves. Bulkley believed that he was witnessing the confluence of the Pacific Ocean pouring into the strait and the Atlantic Ocean pouring out. Waves began to swallow the Speedwell from stern to bow, hull to mast tops. One rolled the Speedwell more than 20 degrees, then 50, then 80, until it had broached, lying completely on its side, with its masts and sails pressed against the water. As the boat creaked and buckled and flooded, Bulkley was sure it would never arise again. Yet, ever so slowly, the Speedwell began to right itself, the sails emerging as water spilled from the deck and hold. Each momentary reprieve seemed to intensify Bulkley's messianic fervour. He wrote of the storm, "We prayed earnestly for its clearing up, for nothing else could save us from perishing." In what he described as a grace of light, they glimpsed a cove, and managed to slip through the breakers and in. "We call this harbour the port of God's mercy, esteeming our preservation this day to be a miracle," Bulkley wrote. With each grinding day, though, the men were becoming more dispirited and unruly. They incessantly demanded extra rations, and Bulkley and Baines found themselves in the same unwinnable position that had confounded Cheap. To pacify the men, Bulkley released a bit more flour from their stores, noting that many people eat the powder raw as soon as they are served it. Nevertheless, they were dying. Among the casualties was a 16-year-old George Bateman. "This poor creature starved, perished, and died a skeleton," Bulkley wrote. One Marine began to go mad, laughing hysterically until he slumped over in silence, dead. Another man died shortly after, and then another. Their bodies were tossed into the sea. Meanwhile, on Wager Island, Cheap had not given up on his plan to rejoin Commodore Anson and the squadron. Marooned on the island, the group, after suffering one death, numbered 19, including Byron, Campbell, the Marine Lieutenant Hamilton, and the surgeon Elliot. It had been 2 months since the others had left. Cheap, spared what Byron described as the riotous applications, menaces, and disturbance of an unruly crew, seemed renewed, engaged, alive. "He now became very brisk," Campbell observed, "went about everywhere to get wood and water, made fires, and proved an excellent cook." Using the skills that they had acquired while refurbishing the longboat, the men were able to repair the splintered yawl, which had been given to the captain by Bulkley, and reinforce the barge. Meanwhile, 3 casks of beef had been fished out of the sunken Wager, and Cheap had managed to conserve some of it for the upcoming journey. The men were impatient to flee the island, and in mid-December the castaways began to pack their few supplies into the 24-foot barge and the 18-foot yawl. Amid the tangle of bodies, ropes, and supplies, they each had barely a foot of room. Campbell, Hamilton, and 6 others were similarly crammed into the yawl. Cheap glanced at the outpost, their home for the past 7 months. All that remained were some scattered, wind-beaten shelters, evidence of a life-and-death struggle that would soon be wiped away by the elements. At his signal, Byron and the rest of the men shoved off from Wager Island, beginning their long, daunting journey north. They'd have to navigate nearly 100 miles through the Gulf of Paine, then proceed another 250 miles along the Pacific coastline to the island of Chiloé. After only an hour, the rains began to beat down and the winds came out of the west, cold and hard. Avalanches of waves buried the boats. It was impossible for the men to bail fast enough with their hats in hands, and so they were forced to do the unthinkable: throw overboard virtually all their supplies, including the precious casks of food. The famished men, looked on as their last rations were swallowed by the voracious sea. By nightfall, Cheap and the party had found their way into a cove along the coast. They went ashore, hoping to discover a covering to sleep under, but eventually they collapsed on an open bed of rocks. They dreamed of their shelters on Wager Island. Campbell wrote, "It froze so hard that by morning several of us were almost dead." Cheap hastened everyone back into the boats. They rowed hour after hour, day after day, occasionally stopping to peel seaweed off sunken rocks and make a meal of what they called sea tangle. 9 days after leaving Wager Island, they had travelled nearly 100 miles. To the northwest, they could see the tip of a cape with 3 enormous cliffs. They were almost at the end of the gulf. Surely they had weathered the worst of the journey. They paused on shore to sleep, and when they awoke the next morning, they realized that the date was the 25th of December. They celebrated Christmas with a feast of sea tangle and cups of fresh stream water, Adam's wine as they called it, because that was all God had given Adam to drink. Cheap toasted to the health of King George II before they packed up and sailed on. A few days later they descended on the Cape, the most critical point in the route. The seas converging here seethed with overpowering currents and colossal waves, and they had to pull the oars with all their might. Cheap urged them on. After hours they came abreast of the first of 3 cliffs. They must pull for their king and country. They must pull for their wives and sons, and daughters and mothers, and fathers and sweethearts, and one another. They reached the second cliff, only to be hurled back and forced to retreat into a nearby bay. The next morning they shot a seal and cooked it over a wood fire, tearing off chunks of fat and chewing them. Nothing was left to waste. Byron even made shoes of the skins, wrapping them around his nearly frostbitten feet. That night, amidst the roaring breakers, the yawl sank, drowning 1 man. The party now numbered 18, and without the yawl, there was no longer room to transport them all. 3 more men could fit with difficulty in the barge, but 4 members of the party would have to remain behind, or they would all perish. 4 Marines were selected. Being soldiers, they lacked sailing skills. This was a melancholy thing, but necessity compelled us, Campbell confessed, and he recorded each of the Marines' last names: Smith, Hobbs, Hartford, and Crosslet. Cheap distributed to them some armaments and a frying pan. Our hearts melted with compassion for them, Campbell wrote. As the barge sailed away, the 4 Marines stood on the beach, gave them 3 cheers, and cried, "God bless the King." 6 weeks after Cheap and his party fled Wager Island, they reached the Cape for the 3rd time, and for a 3rd time they were beaten back. Cheap wanted to keep trying, but the men would no longer abide his devouring obsessions, and they decided to return to Wager Island. "We had now lost all hopes of ever revisiting our native country," Campbell wrote, and they preferred to spend their last days on the island, which had become a kind of home. Cheap reluctantly assented. It took them nearly 2 weeks to circle back to the island, and by then the entire disastrous foray had lasted 2 months. They'd exhausted all their food from the journey. Byron had even eaten the rancid, foul-smelling sealskins covering his feet. Back at their outpost, they huddled together, listening to the hush of the sea. The Wager by David Grann, read by Luke Treadaway, Episode 9. After the Wager was shipwrecked off the coast of Patagonia, its diseased and starving crew lost faith in their captain, and mutiny followed. Captain Cheap and a handful of men loyal to him set off in a rickety barge to join the rest of their squadron on the coast of Chile. But, after 3 failed attempts to round the northern cape of the Gulf of Pain, they have returned to the bleak outpost where their wrecked warship still lies. Meanwhile, it's a different story for the mutineers led by Bulkley, who headed for Brazil on the refurbished longboat, the Speedwell. Bulkley and the 58 other castaways on the Speedwell were back on course, drifting through the Strait of Magellan toward the Atlantic. The Speedwell, in its battered, leaking condition, was unable to sail close to the wind, and Bulkley struggled to maintain its course. Sometimes sailing, sometimes rowing, they floated past dusty wooded hills and blue glaciers, the Andes looming in the distance with their immortal caps of snow. At its widest, the strait extended 20 miles, but here it tapered to just 2. Navigating the narrowest point was treacherous. The tide rose and fell by some 40 feet, and there were countervailing winds and 8-knot currents. It was night time when the castaways began sailing through the 9-mile-long chute, and they strained to see in the dark. At dawn they emerged, and were soon being swept into the Atlantic. Still, the port of Rio Grande, which was the closest settlement in Brazil, was more than 1,600 miles north, and to get there they would have to traverse a coastline, now part of Argentina, under Spanish control, which meant that they would face the added danger of being captured. One night, as the boat banged in the waves, part of the rudder broke off, making it even harder to maneuver. Once again, they were out of food and virtually all their water. Few stirred. Bulkley noted, "There are not above 15 of us healthy, if people may be called healthy that are scarce able to crawl. I am reckoned at present one of the strongest men in the boat, yet can hardly stand on my legs 10 minutes together." Nominally in command, Lieutenant Baines wrote of "our poor fellows dying daily." On the 26th of January, the cook, Thomas McLean, the oldest man on the voyage, who had endured hurricanes and scurvy and shipwreck, took his last breath. He was 82. Bulkley still jotted scratchily in his journal, but his mind was fading. Once he thought he saw butterflies snowing from the sky. On the 28th of January, 1742, the boat was blown toward the shore, and Bulkley perceived a tableau of strange shapes. Was it another mirage? He looked again. The shapes, he was sure, were wooden structures, houses, and they were situated on the edge of a major river. It had to be the port of Rio Grande. After the castaways had spent 3.5 months traversing nearly 3,000 miles, they had reached the safety of Brazil. As the Speedwell drifted into the port, a crowd of townspeople gathered. They gaped at the battered, waterlogged vessel with its sun-bleached, shredded sails. Then they saw the almost unrecognizable human forms strewn about the deck and piled on top of one another in the hold. Half-naked figures with protruding bones, their skin peeled off from the sun. Many of the men could not move, but Bulkley staggered to his feet. When he explained that they were the remnants of the crew of HMS Wager, which had sunk 8 months earlier off the coast of Chile, the onlookers were even more astounded. The governor of the town came to meet them and called their arrival a miracle. The party, which had set out from Wager Island with over 70 men, had dwindled to 29. The sick were carted to hospital, and Bulkley and some of the men were provided a warm, comfortable house in which to recuperate, and brought plates with fresh bread and grilled slabs of beef. "We think ourselves very happily fixed," Bulkley wrote. People from across Brazil began to travel to pay tribute to them, this band of seafarers, commanded by a gunner who had pulled off one of the longest castaway voyages. The Speedwell was hauled on land and became an object of pilgrimage. Bulkeley sent off a letter to a British naval officer in Rio de Janeiro to inform him of his group's arrival. And he mentioned one other thing, that Captain Cheap had, at his own request, tarried behind. One evening, Bulkeley went with a companion for a walk in the Brazilian countryside, relishing his newfound freedom. When they returned to the house where they were staying, they noticed that the locks to the doors had been broken. The two men gingerly stepped inside. Objects were scattered about Bulkeley's bedroom as if someone had been rummaging around. Bulkeley heard a noise and turned just as two intruders leapt toward them. After a violent struggle, the assailants fled. Bulkeley had recognized one of them. It was a fellow castaway who was known to do the bidding of John King, the boatswain who, during the mutiny on Wager Island, had punched Captain Cheap in the face. The intruders had been clearly searching Bulkeley's quarters, but what could they possibly want from a gunner who was now destitute? He soon discovered what they were after: his journal. Bulkeley had been the only person to keep a contemporaneous account on Wager Island, and King and some of his allies apparently feared what it might divulge about their roles in overthrowing Captain Cheap. The lives of the former castaways were once again at risk, only now the danger was not from the natural elements, but from the stories that they would tell the Admiralty. There was still no news of Cheap and his party, and it seemed unlikely they would ever emerge to tell their side. But what if they did? The sense of paranoia deepened. Lieutenant Baines was particularly worried as the ranking officer in the group, and in March 1742, Baines fled on a boat for England. He wanted to arrive before the others and get his story on the record first. It took months for Bulkeley and Cummins to secure passage on another vessel, and when they stopped along the way in Portugal, they were informed by several English merchants that Baines had already made damning accusations against them. "We were even advised not to return to our country, lest we should suffer death for mutiny," Bulkeley wrote. He told the merchants that Baines was an unreliable source who, tellingly, had never kept a diary on the island. Then Bulkeley revealed, like a holy writ, his own voluminous journal. Bulkeley and Cummins proceeded on their voyage home. Bulkeley was still compulsively adding to his journal. "We were confident of our innocence and determined to see our country," he wrote. On the 1st of January 1743, their ship dropped anchor in Portsmouth. In the distance, they could observe their houses. Bulkeley had not seen his wife and 5 children for more than 2 years. "We thought of nothing but going ashore immediately to our families," Bulkeley wrote, but the Navy barred the men from leaving the ship. Baines had provided a written statement to the Admiralty in which he alleged that Cheap had been overthrown by a band of mutineers led by Bulkeley and Cummins, who tied up the captain and deserted him on Wager Island. The Admiralty ordered both men to be detained under guard pending a court-martial. Bulkeley called Baines's account an imperfect narrative, arguing that a story drawn from memory, as Baines admitted his was, had less value than one written contemporaneously. And when Bulkeley was asked to furnish his own statement to the Admiralty, he decided to offer his entire journal, which he had risked his life to protect. Although he had composed it in the first person, he added Cummins as a co-author, likely to lend the account greater authority and to shield his best friend from punishment. The journal laid out, from their point of view, the events that had led to the uprising, including allegations that Captain Cheap had mentally unravelled and killed Midshipman Cousins by shooting him in the head. When Bulkeley submitted the journal, he also handed over the supporting legalistic documents that had been drafted on the island, documents that Baines himself had conspicuously signed. Members of the Admiralty found themselves confounded by the competing versions of events, and decided to postpone the investigation at least until Cheap could be officially pronounced dead. Bulkeley and Cummins, meanwhile, were released. Our families had long given us over for lost, Bulkley wrote, and they looked upon us as sons, husbands, and fathers restored to them in a miraculous manner. Yet until the judicial case was resolved, Bulkley and his party remained in a kind of purgatory. When Bulkley was a castaway, he had stopped waiting around for others in power to display leadership, and now he decided to launch another kind of rebellion, a literary one. He began plotting to publish his journal. Bulkley would shape the public's perceptions and, just as he had on the island, rally the people to his side. Anticipating that some would consider the journal's publication a scandal, it was common for senior officers to release narratives of their voyages, but not a mere gunner, he wrote a preface to preempt criticisms. "We don't set up for naturalists and men of great learning," Bulkley wrote. "We only relate such things as could not possibly escape our knowledge, and what we actually know to be true." After reading the journal, he argued, people would be able to judge for themselves whether he and Cummins deserved any punishment. "Our confining the captain is reckoned an audacious and unprecedented action, but the reader will find that necessity absolutely compelled us to act as we did." The account was something striking in English letters. Though hardly a work of literature, the journal was packed with more narrative and personal detail than a traditional logbook, and the story was told in a bracing new voice, that of a hard-nosed seaman. By the time Bulkley and Cummins were ready to sell their manuscript, there was intense public demand for any information about the shipwreck and the alleged mutiny. Published 6 months after their return, the book sold for 3 shillings and 6pence a copy, and was serialised in the London Magazine. Some members of the Admiralty and aristocracy expressed outrage at what they considered a two-pronged attack by a gunner and a carpenter on their commanding officer. First they had tied up Cheap, and now they were impugning him in print. One told Bulkley, "How dare you presume to touch a gentleman's character in so public a manner?" But the book went into a second printing and swayed much of the public to take the side of Bulkley and his party. Bulkley had feared a written rejoinder, a countertale, but none came. Though, as he had learned from his voyage, a reprieve rarely lasts. It is inevitably shattered by some unforeseen event, and almost 3 years later, on a March day in 1746, a boat arrived in Dover, carrying a thin, stern man with eyes fixed like bayonets. It was the long-lost Captain David Cheap, and accompanying him were the Marine Lieutenant Thomas Hamilton and the midshipman John Byron. The Wager by David Grann, read by Luke Treadaway, Episode 10. After Bulkley and his fellow mutineers had returned to England, Bulkley had published his journal. Here the gunner had set out his version of what happened after the warship, the Wager, was shipwrecked, and he and a faction of the castaways took the law into their own hands. After arresting Captain Cheap for the murder of one of their own, they left the captain to fend for himself on a bleak island off the Patagonian coast and made their escape. Then in March 1746, 3 seamen landed in Dover: Thomas Hamilton, John Byron, and Captain David Cheap. Five and a half years. That's how long the 3 men had been gone from England. Presumed dead, they had been mourned, and yet here they were, like 3 Lazaruses. They began to unspool details of what had happened. Days after they had returned to Wager Island, following their failed attempt to leave, a small party of seafaring people, known as the Chono, had appeared in 2 canoes. At that time, Cheap, Byron, and Hamilton were stranded with 10 other castaways, including Midshipman Campbell and the surgeon, Elliot. One of the Chono men approached them and addressed them in Spanish, which Elliot could understand. He indicated that he'd been to Chiloé Island, the site of the nearest Spanish settlement. The castaways beseeched him to help them navigate their one remaining boat, the barge, to the island. In exchange, they'd give him the barge when they arrived. He agreed, and they set out, hugging the coast as they rowed northward. Soon afterward, while many in the party were searching for food along the shore, 6 of the castaways absconded with the barge, never to be heard from again. What could provoke the villains to do so foul a deed I cannot tell, except it was their cowardice, Cheap recalled in his account. Campbell, however, had overheard the deserters whispering about their desire to be free of their maniacal captain. The Chono continued piloting the group across the Golfo de Penas. Without the barge, they proceeded in the Chono's canoes, stopping periodically to gather food on shore. During the journey, 2 castaways died. As the remaining men continued across the Gulf, they followed their Chono guide's advice about when to row and when to rest, and how to find shelter and limpets. Even so, the castaways' accounts betrayed their inherent racism, Byron regularly referring to the Chono as savages. After travelling some 70 miles, the castaways could see the cape of the Gulf that they had previously failed to round. To their surprise, their guides didn't lead them in that direction. Instead, they hauled the canoes onto land and proceeded to break the boats apart, each one separating into 5 distinct components. Everyone was given a piece to lug except for Cheap. Without any more dreams to sustain him, he seemed to be disintegrating, not only physically, but mentally. Hoarding his small bits of food and muttering to himself, he required help walking the moment the trek started. The castaways followed the Chono overland along a secret path, an 8-mile portage route through the wilderness, which allowed them to avoid the perilous seas around the cape. At the end of the portage, the Chono reassembled the canoes and launched them into a channel that wound between the fractured islands off Chile. For weeks the party edged northward, rowing from channel to channel, fjord to fjord, until one day in June 1742 they glimpsed a headland in the distance. It was Chiloé Island. It had been 3 months since they had departed Wager Island, and nearly a year since they had been shipwrecked. Cheap was in the gravest condition. I could compare his body to nothing but an anthill, with thousands of insects crawling all over it, Byron noted. The men trudged through heavy snow to an indigenous village, where the inhabitants provided them food and shelter. They began to recover. Even Cheap rebounded some, and in a few days they set out for another village. As they made their way, a phalanx of Spanish soldiers suddenly descended upon them. After enduring tempests, scurvy, shipwreck, abandonment, and starvation, the castaways were now captives. They were transported in a ship to Valparaiso on the Chilean mainland. There they were thrown into what was called the Condemned Hole, which was so dark that they were unable to see one another's faces. As people from the region came to catch a glimpse of the prized prisoners, the guards would take them out of the hole and parade them about like circus animals. The soldiers made a pretty penny, as they took money from every person for the sight, Byron noted. 7 months after they were apprehended, they were moved again, this time to Santiago, where they met with the governor. He considered them prisoners of war, but also gentlemen. He granted them parole, and they were allowed to live outside the prison. Though they were no longer imprisoned, they couldn't leave Chile, and their lives moved glacially. Every day here seems to me an age, Cheap lamented. Finally, 2.5 years after they had been captured, they were told that they could go home. Major offensives between Britain and Spain had ceased, and the countries had reached an agreement to exchange any prisoners. As Cheap Byron and Hamilton made their way back home, they sailed past Wager Island and round Cape Horn, as if they were journeying through their ravaged past. Yet, in the everlasting mystery of the sea, this time the passage was relatively calm. When they reached Dover, David Cheap immediately made his way to London. Now he discovered that the gunner John Bulkeley had accused him, in a book no less, of being an incompetent, murderous commander, a charge that could end his life. Cheap, in a letter to an Admiralty official, decried Bulkeley and his associates as liars. He burned to tell his own version, but decided to save his testimony and fury for a court-martial. Within days of Cheap's return, the Admiralty issued a summons for all of the Wager's surviving officers and seamen to appear in Portsmouth for a court-martial. The case against all of the men of the Wager seemed overwhelming. They were accused of a complete breakdown of naval order, from the highest levels of command to the rank and file, and all the former castaways' accounts contained certain incontrovertible facts. Neither side disputed that Bulkeley, Baines, and their party had tied up their captain and left him on the island, or that Cheap had shot an unarmed man without any legal proceedings or even any warning. But a naval court-martial was intended to do more than adjudicate the innocence or guilt of those on trial. It was meant to uphold and reinforce discipline throughout the service. As one expert put it, the system was contrived to convey the majesty and strength of the state, and to ensure that the few who were guilty of serious crimes would serve as examples. The survivors of the Wager had every reason to expect to be hanged, or as Bulkeley put it, to fall by the violence of power. On the 15th of April, 1746, a Union Jack was hoisted atop one of the masts of HMS Prince George, where the proceedings were to take place. A cannon fired. The court-martial was beginning. 13 judges appeared on deck in their formal dress. All were officers of high rank, captains and commodores, and a vice-admiral. Cheap and the other defendants were brought in. As was then customary, they were not represented by lawyers, they had to defend themselves. Prior to the hearing, each defendant had been required to give a statement of facts, which was then presented in evidence. When Bulkeley was called to record his, he protested that he still did not know what charges were being filed against him. He was told that at the moment he simply needed to provide a deposition on the cause of the shipwreck. Now, as the trial began, Cheap was the first to answer questions. On the limited matter regarding the wrecking of the Wager, he levelled just one accusation, that Lieutenant Baines had been derelict in his duties by failing to inform him that the carpenter, Cummins, had reported seeing land the day before the ship struck the rocks. A judge asked Cheap, "Do you charge any officer besides the lieutenant with being in any degree accessory to the loss of the Wager?" "No, sir. I acquit them all of that," he replied. Before long, it was Bulkeley's turn. He too was interrogated only about the loss of the Wager. A judge asked him why, before the ship ran aground, he had not tried with others to release its anchor. "The cable was foul," Bulkeley replied. "Have you anything to object to the conduct of the captain or officers, or to his proceedings for the good and preservation of the ship and crew?" Bulkeley had already answered this question by publishing his journal. In those pages he had pointedly blamed Cheap. Yet now, as Bulkeley spoke before the 13 judges, he sensed that something about the legal proceedings was amiss. He had not been charged with mutiny, or indeed with anything at all. It was as if he were being offered an unspoken bargain, and so Bulkeley decided to leave some things unspoken as well. "I can lay nothing to the charge of any officer," he said. Thus it went. The carpenter, Cummins, was asked, "Have you anything to lay to the charge of the captain for neglecting the preservation of the ship?" "No," he replied, passing over the fact that he had once accused Cheap directly to his face of causing the wreck, not to mention having called him a murderer in print. After a brief adjournment, the court returned. It had reached a unanimous verdict. that Captain David Cheap had done his duty and used all means in his power to have preserved His Majesty's ship Wager under his command. All the other officers and crew were also absolved on this count, except for Baines, who received a mere reprimand. Bulkeley was overjoyed by the verdict. He boasted that he had been honourably acquitted. Cheap must have been alerted beforehand of the court's limited focus, for he never pressed his allegations against Bulkeley and his men. Though Cheap was denied his long-sought retribution, he too had been spared any punishment. He hadn't even been stripped of his cherished title of captain. There were no further proceedings. No adjudication of whether Cheap had been guilty of murder, or whether Bulkeley and his followers had mutinied and attempted to kill their commander. The British authorities, it seemed, didn't want either side's story to prevail. And to justify this outcome, they relied on a murky facet of the regulations, because naval rules stated that, after a shipwreck, the seamen on board were no longer entitled to wages. The castaways might have assumed that they were not subject to naval law on the island. It is impossible to know for sure what transpired behind the scenes, but there were certainly reasons for the Admiralty to want the case to disappear. Ferreting out and documenting all the incontrovertible facts of what had happened on the island, the marauding, the stealing, the whippings, the murders, would have undercut the central claim on which the British Empire tried to justify its rule of other peoples, namely, that its imperial forces, its civilization, were inherently superior, that its officers were gentlemen, not brutes.